So I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of fake news, which has become an important issue in the last 3 years in politics, and what role it might play in 2020, and whether it's possible to use data analytics and technology to combat fake news in the 2020 election. Just for a sound check, can you still hear me okay? Okay, great. So since 2016, foreign and domestic actors have been successfully promoting fake news in order to win elections. And as an example, there have been a number of studies from bipartisan committee of the U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee, from a variety of law enforcement forces, including the FBI, and from a number of journalism outlets. And what we've seen is that in 2016, there are foreign actors led by Russia, but since 2016 copied by other countries, have used social media and other online platforms to create and disseminate fake news. And they've done this for a few reasons, one of which is to sow discord within the United States, and another is to help their preferred candidates in the election. So in 2016, for example, according to an indictment from the US Department of Justice, Russians generated fake accounts to create events in support of Donald Trump and in opposition, in order to increase discord in the United States, as well as to help their preferred candidate. So as examples listed in this article, there were simultaneous New York rallies that were generated, one to support Trump and another under the name Trump is not my president. They also organized an anti-Trump rally in Charlotte, North Carolina. Furthermore, members of the Trump campaign unwittingly aided the Russians with some of their events by providing signs, for example, and the defendants in this case concealed their identities by creating fake accounts that they pretended to be for people in the US. So they created handles they created Facebook groups such as Being Patriotic, the Twitter handle March for Trump. They organized events titled March for Trump and Down with Hillary. They created a Facebook group called United Muslims of America to plan a rally called Support Hillary, Save American Muslims. Furthermore, they arranged for an American to hold a sign depicting Clinton and a fake quote attributed to her, the fake quote saying, "I think Sharia law will be a powerful new direction of freedom." Florida was a focus, Pennsylvania, battleground states, and other battleground states such as Colorado and Virginia. And then they covered their tracks by deleting some of these emails and accounts after the election. Moving to the next slide. So this is another article from the New York Times. A particular target of influence was African Americans in the United States. So the idea was in the United States, 80 to 90% of African Americans vote for Democratic candidates. When Obama was the candidate, over 90% of Democrats voted for, over 90% of African Americans voted for the Democrat. When the candidates were Hillary Clinton, that number dropped down into the 80s. And that difference may sound very small, but in an election that was as close as the election in 2016, that's the difference between winning and losing. So for example, according to a report for the Senate Intelligence Committee, which is discussed in the New York Times, there's a Russian influence campaign run by a company in St. Petersburg, Russia called the Internet Research Agency. which is owned by a businessman who is a close ally of Vladimir Putin. And according to this report from a bipartisan Senate committee, the goal of this agency was to create fake social media accounts on every platform to support Donald Trump, first in the Republican primary and then in the general election and as president. And part of the way they did that was by recruiting Black Americans and trying to increase discord in the United States among Black Americans, and to use that information both to turn Black Americans against the Democratic candidate and also to create content that could then be cross-promoted to Republican supporters to demonstrate issues that they would be opposed to, such as Black Lives Matter, for example, and talking about police brutality. So moving on, we see on slide 4 what some of the results of this campaign were. So on the left side of the page, we see what turnout was among eligible African-American citizens in the United States in 2012 and 2016. So in 2012, 66% of Black Americans turned out to vote in the presidential election. In 2016, 59% of eligible Black Americans turned out to vote. So that 7-point drop in turnout was significant. It was especially significant in some of the critical states in the 2016 election, including Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. The change in Black turnout and Black support for the Democratic candidate in 2016 was itself enough to account for more than the margin of victory in those 3 states. And similarly, we saw the Democratic vote, according to the exit poll, dip from 93% among Black Americans to 89%. And Donald Trump has indicated a couple times in his statements that the decline in turnout by Black Americans helped him to win. So on December 11th, for example, 2016, he said, the African-American community was great to us. If they had any doubt, they didn't vote. And that was almost as good because a lot of people didn't show up. And then in 2018, he said, they didn't come out to vote for Hillary. They didn't come out, and that was big. So thank you to the African-American community. So there's a recognition by Trump that, that the lower turnout among African-Americans was helpful to him. Moving on to slide 5. So since then, one of the biggest controversies in the past few months has been that Facebook has decided that they're not going to fact check paid ads by political candidates and campaigns. And so these are 2 examples of ads that contain false information that Facebook has said they're going to accept money from the Trump campaign to run these ads. They're not going to fact check them. And so moving on to the next slide, these are quotes from articles from discussions with Mark Zuckerberg. So in one article, in one interview, Zuckerberg said that, for example, Facebook posts that deny that the Holocaust took place will not be removed from the platform. He said the goal of Facebook is not to prevent people from saying things that are untrue, but to stop fake news from spreading across the social network. So if something is deemed to be fake, it might remain on the website, but it would be pushed down in the news feed so fewer people would see it. And then in a separate article, more recently regarding this issue of paid ads, Zuckerberg was asked if he would disallow ads that contain false information, and he said that he would not, that Facebook does not want to be in the business of fact-checking. So moving on, the question is, what can data analytics and technology be used to stop the spread of fake news, and if so, how? So there are a few things that we can do, and there are a few things that are being done. So one thing that data analytics and technology can do is help provide evidence of impact. So one way to do that is with randomized controlled experiments, and this has been done. So what we do is we take some fake news, we take some real news, we deliver those pieces of information to actual voters, and we can do that with paid ads on Facebook, we can do that with direct mail, we can do that with addressable television ads, and then we measure the impact. How do we measure the impact? In two ways. One, we can survey people. So we can survey them offline, or we can survey them online, telephone calls, emails, ask them to click to indicate which candidate they support. We can also look at whether they actually turned out to vote on election day. So if the goal of an ad is to encourage someone to vote or discourage them from voting, we can observe after the election whether that person actually turned out to vote, because who has turned out to vote in an election is public in every state in the United States. So we can conduct these randomized controlled experiments, and we can provide evidence of impact. And there have been a number of academic studies after the 2016 election that show that kind of impact. They show what the influence of some of these news articles was, fake news posts on voters. Furthermore, we can identify who the targets of these ads are and who the sponsors of these ads are. So in the case of political ads, for example, Facebook has changed its policy and agreed to provide more transparency. So Facebook now is, for political campaigns that purchase ads, will include who is paying for the ad, and they will provide information to the public about who is being targeted and how much is being spent, which is something that political campaigns have had access to for television ads for many years, and now that is available online as well. So that is useful and helpful. There are other ways as well that we can identify who the sponsors of ads are and who the targets of those ads are. One way we can do that is with surveys. We can ask people, have you seen these ads? Another way we can do that is by crowdsourcing. So asking people who is seeing these ads to identify targets, for example. And then there are a lot of ways to look at metadata and patterns of who is sharing content, when Twitter accounts or Facebook accounts are being created, where they're being created, that can help identify both who is sponsoring and who the targets of those accounts are. Measuring the effectiveness of fake news and responses. So just as we can set up randomized controlled experiments to determine evidence of impact, we can test ads against each other, and we can test ads and responses to identify what is the most effective response. So if someone is putting out a false attack, we can test that against two different responses, and then using two treatment groups, for example, and a control group that gets no response. And then we can survey all three groups to identify which of these responses is most effective. We can also identify which is more effective among which audiences. So we can target different responses to different groups of voters based on the impact that each of those possible response ads is having on voters. We can also provide tools and techniques to help spot fake news, to identify what is trending, who is generating it, who is spreading it. And while I've talked a lot about the US, the 2016, and starting to think about the 2020 election, this is something that's going on everywhere in the world. So, I've worked on elections in the past 2 years in Malaysia, Indonesia, and South Africa, and in the UK. In each of these, there have been issues of fake news, some of it coming from overseas, some of it domestic in each of these countries. And there are organizations, tech startups in many cases, as well as political parties and candidates who are developing tools and techniques to monitor, identify, and push back against this fake news. To a significant extent, I think that we were caught unawares in 2016. We weren't prepared for the onslaught. We weren't prepared for the impact that it would have. And while we're a long way from solving this problem, there's been a lot of work done in the last 3 years, and a lot of work is ongoing right now, testing various tools and techniques to try to push back against this. I do not think this is a solved problem at all, but I do think that there's a lot of work going on right now that is useful and helpful in identifying some of these problems. Once we've done that, once we've identified what is fake, what is trending, where it's coming from, who's spreading it, where that is going, and what the most effective rebuttals are, we can deliver that information to the right targets. And there are a lot of ways that can be done both online and offline. You know, the best way to rebut some of this information is offline, with a person-to-person, volunteer-to-voter conversation, for example, particularly among people you know or people you trust. So a lot of this rebuttal is offline, but a lot of it is online as well. And then finally, collecting evidence, because with that evidence, we can bring that evidence to regulators or would-be regulators, to legal authorities, to the platforms such as Facebook, and seek legal, financial, et cetera, remedies. So who is actively working on this problem? In the short term, the federal government is of limited use. The federal government operates slowly. Government in general operates slowly, and particularly in an area that is constantly changing. So not only is the way that people are using these platforms constantly changing, but the policies of these platforms are constantly changing. The platforms themselves generally don't have the right incentives. So some of the folks who are being most active are, as I mentioned earlier, political parties, candidates, campaigns, and their allies. National security agencies are getting involved, but a lot of the most innovative and interesting work is being done by the technology, data, and analytics communities. So on the left, on the bottom of this slide, is an organization called Higher Ground Labs. And that's an organization that comes from the progressive space, so from the democratic supporting space. And they've identified 36 tech startups that they're interested in supporting that are looking at various technology, data, and analytics solutions for solving problems related to not only fake news, but also other issues and concerns related to data privacy, motivating voters, persuading voters, et cetera. And then there are a number of public, nonpartisan groups as well. So articles from Hacker Noon, for example, and others have identified a number of different companies, some of which are focused on identifying fake news, some of which are focused on identifying where it's coming from, some who are focused on identifying who it's targeting, some that are focused on identifying ways to push back against it, some are providing ratings. And so there are a number of different ways to attack this problem, and many of them are being looked at now. It's not clear yet which of these are most successful, which of these deserve more investment, and which are going to be less useful. And also, as mentioned, because it's changing so quickly, because the self-regulatory policies of these platforms is constantly changing, as well as the impact of regulators, as well as, of course, social media behavior, always constantly changing, new platforms popping up all the time, usage of existing platforms changing all the time, availability of different features on these platforms changing all of the time. It's an ever-changing landscape, and there will be a lot more changes between now and November 2020. We cannot and should not assume that the tech landscape is going to remain static for the next 12 months. We cannot and should not assume that Twitter's and Facebook's policies are going to remain static for the next 12 months, because they will not. So what's next? Eventually, there's going to be some combination of self-regulation and/or government regulation. The current status quo is not going to be allowed to exist. So either, we've already seen Twitter in the last week or two already announced that they're not going to accept paid political ads anymore. Paid political ads were a very small part of Twitter's business. So we don't know what we don't expect the impact of that to be very large. Facebook would have a bigger impact, but even the paid political ads on Facebook that are coming directly from candidates and campaigns are a relatively small piece of the puzzle. A lot more important is the activity on all of these platforms from individuals, bots that are being created on Twitter that are pushing out fake news and then are effective at spreading virally throughout the platform. The political environment matters a lot. The main reason that Facebook has not disallowed political ads or disallowed political ads that contain fake news is not because they need the money, it's because they're afraid of the political backlash. And so, some of these platforms, for example, Twitter and Facebook, have investigated, well, what if we banned all racist content from our platforms? The problem they find is when Twitter or Facebook ban all racist content from their platforms, they end up, depending on how the algorithm is written, they end up striking and removing a lot of conservative content, a lot of conservative media content, a lot of conservative politicians. And so they're unwilling to do that for political reasons. They're unwilling to disproportionately disallow conservatives from appearing on their platform. And so they've decided, well, it's too complicated, and therefore we're not going to disallow all racist content, for example. Of course, there's always error, no matter how good the algorithm is. And at a certain point, there's also a matter of judgment. What is racist content? What is hateful content? What is violent content? So but those things have to be defined. That's not easy to do. And then you have this problem of error. So you're removing some content that should not be removed, and you're allowing other content that should be removed. And so what are the ways that we can improve our algorithms to reduce both type 1 and type 2 error? And again, this is something that can't be static, but has to be constantly improved and developed. So what do we need? We need more accurate tools, more accurate techniques, and more accurate algorithms. There need to be some legal and financial penalties. Government has gotten worse at developing and enforcing rules fairly, in part because of the current political environment, which is so polarized and so divided. And finally, government is not good at developing, modernizing, and enforcing rules fairly when technology is involved at all, let alone when technology is constantly changing. So whether we think about wireless telephones, regulation of the internet, cable television regulation, government has been very poor at regulating those industries, particularly when the technology is changing. And so while there is a role for government regulation, and the problem is not going to be solved without it, that is also not sufficient. There has to be some self-policing by the platforms, and there also has to be work by outside actors. Some of these tech companies, fact-checking organizations, nonpartisan, bipartisan groups that are doing this kind of work as well. So with that, I will open up to questions.